The Grand View, perched high above New York City, hummed with the vibrancy of Manhattan's elite. The crisp September night wrapped the city in a velvet cloak, its lights sparkling like a sea of diamonds beneath the towering skyscrapers. Inside the luxurious rooftop bar, champagne flutes clinked, laughter echoed, and the air was thick with the promise of power and privilege. At the heart of it all, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, was Zach Westbrook. A towering figure, his perfectly tailored suit clung to his athletic frame, the kind of power suit that made him seem untouchable. His jaw was sharp, eyes glinting with the same calculating sharpness that had earned him his fortune. At 36, Zach had built an empire, a media conglomerate that redefined the way the world consumed information. He was a billionaire, a mogul, the man everyone wanted to be or be seen with. And tonight, he was in his element, the crowd surrounding him, hanging on his every word. But for all the attention he commanded, something was missing. He could feel it. That gnawing emptiness that seemed to grow with every deal signed, every tower erected, every check written. Nothing satisfied him anymore. Not the acquisitions, not the power, and certainly not the women who flocked to him like moths to a flame. They were predictable, easy, boring. He leaned back against the polished marble bar, swirling his scotch, his eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. And then, in the midst of the glittering faces and sparkling conversation, he saw her. Tessa Fitzgerald. She stood near the podium, talking with a small group of guests, her voice calm and confident as she delivered her thoughts on the charity they were all gathered to support. But it wasn't her words that caught his attention. It was the way she carried herself. Poised, elegant, but entirely unbothered by the attention of the room. She moved through the space as though she had no need for anyone's approval. And it was that unyielding confidence that immediately intrigued Zach. He'd seen women like her before, the ones who didn't fall for his charm or his reputation. But this was different. She wasn't like the socialites who gravitated toward him. Tessa Fitzgerald wasn't playing the game. She didn't seem to care about his wealth, his name, or even the fact that he was standing there, watching her with a mix of fascination and disbelief. It didn't make sense. No one ignored Zach Westbrook, not in a room like this. And yet, Tessa had done just that. She hadn't even spared him a second glance. A playful smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Interesting. For the first time in a long while, Zach felt something stir inside him. A challenge. And he always rose to the challenge. "Hey, Zach," a voice broke his focus. It was Marcus Chen, his college roommate turned CFO. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough so the others couldn't hear. "You're gonna let her get away like that?" Zach turned, offering Marcus a look that could melt steel. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew. Marcus gave him a knowing smile. "You've had every woman in this room, man. Every single one. But not her. Tessa Fitzgerald. She's out of your reach, isn't she?" Zach's jaw tightened, his grip on the glass firming. There it was. That challenge. The one he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. He glanced back at Tessa. She was still talking, still radiating that aura of detachment, unaware of the shift happening behind her. And then, as though sensing his gaze, she turned, just for a moment, and their eyes locked. Something passed between them in that instant. A flicker of recognition, a crack in her armor, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air around them. Zach straightened, setting his glass down with a soft clink. The game had changed. The rules were different now, and he wasn't about to let Tessa Fitzgerald slip away without finding out what made her tick. "You're on?" said, his voice low but steady. "I'll make her fall for me in 30 days. Marcus raised an eyebrow, half in disbelief, half in amusement. "No way. You're actually taking that bet?" Zach nodded, his eyes never leaving Tessa. "The bet's on," he said, his tone hardening with a certainty that sent a chill through the air. "I'm going to make her fall in love with me." It wasn't just about winning. It wasn't just about the pride of proving that no woman could resist him for 30 days. It was something deeper. Something that Zach couldn't quite explain. The challenge wasn't about impressing her or buying her affection with expensive gifts and luxurious dates. No. He couldn't use his fame, his fortune, or his reputation. This time, it was about showing Tessa that there was more to him than just the billionaire playboy everyone saw. It was a game, yes. But this time, the stakes were higher. He was going to show Tessa Fitzgerald a side of him no one had ever seen. He was going to make her believe that he wasn't just the man everyone thought he was, that he could be something more than the wealth and the titles. But as the evening wore on, and the last guests trickled out of the Grandview, Zach couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't going to be as simple as he thought. There was something about Tessa that he couldn't quite grasp. Something that felt different. Dangerous, even. The night ended, but Zach's mind raced. The bet had begun. But Tessa Fitzgerald? She was no ordinary woman. And for the first time in his life, Zach Westbrook wasn't sure he could win. And that, he realized, was what made this challenge all the more intriguing. Zach Westbrook stood on the edge of the Grandview, looking out at the sea of lights stretching far below him, feeling the familiar buzz of Manhattan wrap itself around his shoulders. It was all so easy. Women adored him. Business deals fell into his lap. Success had always been his second skin. But Tessa Fitzgerald was different. There was something about her that made him feel out of place, like a wolf trying to blend in with the sheep. He hadn't been able to shake the image of her, cool, calm, completely unbothered by his presence. It had been hours since their first encounter, but the game had already begun, and Zach couldn't afford to lose. The idea of losing had never occurred to him before. Now, it gnawed at him, deep in his gut. The next evening, Zach stood outside a sleek, minimalist art gallery in Chelsea, the kind of venue that screamed exclusivity. The polished glass and smooth metal architecture reflected the soft lights of the city, glowing like a jewel in the heart of the district. This was the perfect place for Tessa Fitzgerald to showcase her work. She had a reputation in the art world that far surpassed his own in terms of genuine respect. Something Zach had come to admire and, more importantly, something he wanted to earn. The gallery's grand opening was buzzing with New York's elite. Investors, socialites, and artists who all craved the touch of exclusivity that Tessa's exhibitions offered. It was said that if she curated it, it would become an instant classic. And yet, Zach's attention wasn't drawn to the sleek art pieces or the highbrow conversations drifting through the air. His eyes were fixated on one thing only: Tessa. She stood across the room, framed by a massive abstract painting, talking to a small group of guests. There was no mistaking her presence in the room. She was the calm in the storm, the center of attention without lifting a finger. Her simple black dress, paired with a choker that hinted at vintage elegance, only added to the mystique. Her deep brown eyes, unflinching and sharp, scanned the crowd with a calculating gaze, as though she were piecing together the fabric of the world with every person she met. Zach approached slowly, taking a moment to adjust his tie, the weight of the wager suddenly feeling heavier. He was the one who had called the challenge. Now it was time to back it up. With a deep breath, he moved towards her, determined to break through whatever armor she had built around herself. He wasn't going to approach her like the other men in this room. This was about proving something deeper, something more real. Tessa turned as Zach reached her side, her lips curving into a polite but unenthusiastic smile. "Mr. Westbrook," she said, her voice polite but distant. He had to admit, he hadn't expected her to be so composed. Most women fell for his charm, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. But Tessa? She looked at him like he was the last thing she wanted to deal with in this room full of people. "I couldn't help but notice your impeccable taste in art," Zach said, a smile tugging at his lips as he gestured towards the paintings hanging on the wall behind her. "You've certainly outdone yourself." Tessa's eyes flicked briefly to the artwork behind her before returning to Zach. "Thank you," she replied, her voice cool. "But the art isn't the point, is it?" "You didn't come here for the paintings." Zach's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "I'm just here to see what you've curated. I'm sure it's exceptional." He gave her a slight nod, his charm slipping in a little too easily. But Tessa's eyes narrowed slightly, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "If that's what you're after, Mr. Westbrook, I'm afraid you're in the wrong place. You'll find all the high society you could ever need just over there." She gestured lightly behind her, to the group of well-dressed socialites sipping champagne and chatting casually. Zach's jaw tightened, but he hid it well, letting the smile return to his lips. "I'm not interested in the crowd. I was hoping we could talk more about the gallery, about your work." He leaned in just slightly, his tone lowering, attempting to make their conversation feel more intimate than the crowded space around them. Her gaze flicked over his shoulder, her disinterest palpable. "I'm sure you have other people to speak with." Zach stiffened, the dismissal stinging more than he was willing to admit. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered indifference, but there was something about Tessa's coolness that twisted the knife just a little deeper. The women who usually crossed his path were captivated by his wealth, by his charm, by the game he played. But not Tessa. And that irritated him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," he said, not willing to let her slip away so easily. "I'm here for you, Tessa, not the crowd." Her brow raised slightly, and she took a step back, her eyes locking with his. "Really? For me?" She didn't seem impressed. "And what exactly would a billionaire media mogul like you want from a woman like me?" Zach wasn't used to being questioned this way, especially not by a woman who, by all accounts, should have been fawning at his feet. But Tessa was different. "I don't know," Zach began, trying to keep the tone light, though there was a hint of challenge in his voice. "Perhaps I'm curious to know why you don't find me interesting." Tessa studied him for a moment, as though weighing her response. Finally she spoke, her voice steady. "I've spent my life around people like you. Men who believe their wealth and status make them interesting. But to me, it's just noise." Her lips parted in a small, almost pitying smile. "I'm not interested in anything you can offer. No matter how many zeros you have in your bank account." Zach took a step back, taken aback by her bluntness. There was no charm, no flattery that could win her over. She was immune to everything he had used on countless others. And something inside him, the part of him that hated losing, that craved success, wasn't just frustrated. It was intrigued. As the night wore on, Zach found himself unable to shake Tessa from his mind. He mingled with the crowd, spoke with investors, and made the usual rounds, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was facing a real challenge. She wasn't interested in his money or his name. She wasn't impressed by his charm. There was no playbook he could follow to win her over. And that, he realized, made this challenge all the more exciting. Hours later, as the gallery event wound down and the guests began to trickle out, Zach found himself lingering in the shadows near the exit, his gaze still fixed on Tessa. She was speaking with another guest, and though she didn't seem to notice him, Zach couldn't help but watch. There was something about her, something raw and real, that he hadn't seen in anyone in a long time. The way she carried herself, the way she seemed to exist beyond the glittering surface of wealth and influence. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't a prize to be won. And that, Zach realized, was the problem. He didn't just want to win her over. He wanted to know her, the real her. Behind the facade she had carefully constructed, the challenge was just beginning. And for the first time in years, Zach wasn't sure how it would end. The small coffee shop on the corner of 12th and 5th was nothing like the polished venues Zach was used to. No glittering chandeliers, no exclusive clientele, just the soft murmur of conversations, the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee, and a sense of unpretentious comfort that Zach had never fully appreciated until now. The moment he stepped inside, he immediately felt out of place. It wasn't the casual atmosphere or the mismatched furniture that threw him off. It was the people. The kind of people he didn't often find himself surrounded by. Young artists scribbling furiously in notebooks, professors discussing obscure books, and people who seemed to be more interested in the warmth of their drinks than the latest trends in fashion. Tessa was sitting in the corner, just as he'd heard. She was alone, her dark brown eyes hidden behind a pair of reading glasses, her focus entirely on the book she held in her hands. A soft, worn-out cardigan draped over her shoulders, the sleeves rolled up as she jotted down notes in the margins of a thick art history book. Her presence was quiet, almost ethereal, and yet there was an undeniable energy in the way she lost herself in the world of ideas. Zach had come here to observe. He'd done his research, and now it was time to test a new approach. His old strategies, charm, power, flattery, weren't going to work on Tessa. No, she was different. She didn't seem impressed by anything that had to do with his wealth or status, so Zach figured it was time to do something he rarely did. Be real. Be authentic. For a moment, he hesitated at the door. This wasn't a room full of his usual crowd. This was her world, one he barely understood, and the stakes felt higher now, more personal. He had no interest in playing games, and the more he thought about it, the less he cared about the bet. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about understanding her, getting to know the woman who had captivated him without even trying. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to the counter and ordered a coffee. Nothing fancy, just a simple black coffee. He didn't need anything extravagant to blend in. As he walked over to the table where Tessa sat, his heart thudded in his chest. It felt oddly vulnerable to approach her like this, without the mask of his usual persona. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low and steady, trying to keep the nervousness from creeping in. Tessa looked up, her glasses sliding down her nose as she studied him for a moment. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Something that made Zach feel like she was assessing him in ways he wasn't used to. "You're here often?" Zach asked, pulling out the chair opposite her, trying to ease into the conversation. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she shifted slightly in her seat and took another sip of her coffee, as though weighing her response. "Yeah, I like it here. It's quiet," she finally said, her voice calm but not unfriendly. "I come for the coffee, not the crowd." Zach nodded, trying to pick up on the underlying meaning in her words. "I can see why," he replied, glancing around at the room. "It's a far cry from the typical places I end up in." Her gaze flicked briefly toward him, her lips curving slightly at the corners in an almost imperceptible smile. "Yeah, it's not really your scene, is it?" He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Not exactly. But I'm starting to appreciate the charm. The noise of the world doesn't seem so loud here." Tessa tilted her head, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "So what brings a billionaire like you to a place like this?" she asked, her tone casual, but the way she said it made it sound more like an invitation to strip away the layers of pretense. Zach could have played it off with a joke, made it seem like it was just another casual encounter. But something about the way she asked the question made him pause. He didn't want to be the guy who answered with superficiality. Not anymore. "I guess I'm just looking for something real," Zach admitted, surprising even himself with the honesty of his words. Tessa raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "Real?" she repeated, as if testing the word. "What do you mean by real?" Zach leaned forward slightly, willing to drop the armor, if only for a moment. "I'm tired of the usual connections. The people who want something from me, or just want to be seen with me. I'm looking for something different. Something that doesn't come with strings attached." For a brief moment, he saw a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. But it quickly disappeared, replaced with a subtle skepticism. "And you think you'll find that here?" she asked, her voice steady. Zach nodded, more confident now that the words had been spoken. "I think I'll find it wherever I stop pretending to be someone I'm not." Tessa set her coffee cup down and folded her arms in front of her. "Well, I don't know what that looks like," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But I think you're a little late to the game, don't you? You've built this empire, this reputation, on exactly what you're saying you're tired of. You've been playing a role for so long, I'm not sure you know what the real version of yourself looks like anymore." Her words landed like a punch to his gut. He wasn't used to being called out so bluntly, especially by someone who didn't owe him anything. But instead of retreating, something inside him shifted. There was no anger, no defensiveness. Just an understanding, perhaps, even a recognition. "I guess you could say that," Zach admitted. "I've been building things for so long, I haven't really thought about what I've been building them for." Tessa leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying him intently, like she was seeing something he couldn't even recognize about himself. "It's funny," she said slowly. "People like you, people with money, with power, often think they can just buy authenticity. But authenticity doesn't come from being surrounded by things. It comes from being vulnerable, from being open to things you can't control." Zach felt a pang of frustration, but it wasn't aimed at her. No, it was aimed at himself. She was right. He'd spent years using his wealth as a shield, as a tool for control, but it hadn't protected him from this moment. The truth was staring him in the face, and he didn't know what to do with it. "I'm not sure how to start being real," he confessed, his voice lower now, vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. "I'm not sure I even know who the real me is anymore." Tessa looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening just slightly. "Then maybe you need to stop looking for a version of yourself that fits into this world you've created." and start looking for a version that exists outside of it. She stood then, grabbing her coat, ready to leave. But before she turned to walk away, she paused. You've got a lot of work to do, Zach. But the first step is being willing to admit that you're not the person you think you are. You might be surprised at what you find when you stop pretending. And with that, she was gone. Zach sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had stood, her words echoing in his mind. The challenge had taken a sharp turn. He had expected her to be difficult, to test him. But this was different. This was vulnerability, raw and unapologetic, something he wasn't used to dealing with. He wasn't sure why, but for the first time in years, he felt a shift inside himself. Maybe he wasn't playing the game to win anymore. Maybe for the first time, he was playing it to discover something real. The restaurant was a stark contrast to the flashing lights and high-energy atmosphere of Manhattan's typical dining spots. Hidden on a quiet street in the West Village, the intimate bistro was bathed in the soft glow of low-hanging lights, its warmth a quiet refuge from the city's relentless buzz. The hum of distant traffic outside barely reached their table, tucked into a corner by the window, and the muted chatter of a few nearby couples seemed to fade away, leaving only the flickering candlelight between Zach and Tessa. Tonight was different. There were no strings, no games, no grand wagers lurking in the back of his mind. It was just the two of them, a chance to connect beyond the constraints of their usual worlds. Zach had arranged it carefully. No extravagant displays, no surprise offers of access or VIP privileges. Just dinner, a simple meal with no strings attached, designed to show Tessa that he was, for once, offering her something he didn't have to strategize for. Zach had never done this before. He had never sat down across from a woman without a plan, without the weight of expectation, without knowing how it would end. But with Tessa, he was beginning to realize he couldn't force the outcome. This wasn't a game to win. It was something else entirely. Tessa's eyes were softer tonight, not the guarded, distant look he had seen in their earlier meetings. But even as she laughed softly at something he had said, Zach noticed the slight tightness around her jaw, the unspoken weight she carried. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was there, hovering just out of reach. I haven't been out like this in forever, Tessa said, breaking the silence, her voice a gentle hum. It's refreshing. Zach nodded, his fingers curling around his wine glass. He'd never really noticed how much he took the glitzy distractions of his life for granted until he was sitting here, in the simplicity of this moment, with her. He liked it. He liked the stillness, the space to actually breathe. I'm glad, he replied, watching her carefully, the soft flicker of candlelight dancing across her face. I've always been more of a quiet dinner person myself, but I don't get to do this much. The world I'm in doesn't really allow for it. Tessa leaned back, the dim light casting delicate shadows across her features. Sounds lonely. The word stung, and he quickly suppressed the feeling, hiding behind a casual smile. It has its moments, he said, but I think I might be getting tired of it. The constant noise. You ever feel that way? She studied him for a moment before answering, her gaze sharp and calculating in a way he wasn't used to. Tessa was the kind of woman who could dissect a person without even lifting a finger. It was almost unnerving. I think you're just tired of pretending, she said quietly, her eyes not leaving his. That's what you're really tired of? Zach blinked, unsure of how to respond. The words she had spoken hit closer to home than he cared to admit. Pretending. He had spent his whole life pretending to be someone he wasn't, pretending to be satisfied with the life he had, pretending that the game he played with people's lives wasn't slowly eating away at him. He wasn't sure when he started, but somewhere along the way, pretending had become the only way he knew how to exist. He swallowed a mouthful of wine, the bitterness of it somehow mirroring the feeling that had settled in his chest. "Maybe you're right," he said, more to himself than to her. "I've been pretending for so long that I don't know what it feels like not to." Tessa's eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice gentler now. "I can't imagine living like that. Constantly playing a role, hiding behind an image. It sounds exhausting." Zach met her gaze, feeling something inside him crack. It was like a dam breaking, small and almost imperceptible, but it was enough to shift the foundation of everything he thought he knew. "It is," he admitted. "Exhausting. But I didn't know how to stop." She nodded, her lips pressed together thoughtfully. "Most people don't." There was a long silence between them, the hum of the restaurant barely reaching them now. Zach's mind was racing. He wasn't used to being vulnerable like this, especially not with someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth, his power, his success. Tessa didn't care about any of that. She was looking at him, really looking at him, in a way no one ever had before. It was disorienting. "I've been trying to figure you out," Zach said, his voice quiet, more reflective than he intended. "Ever since we met, I've been trying to figure out what makes you tick." Tessa raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And what have you figured out so far?" "That you're impossible," Zach said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That you don't give in to the usual tricks. That you're different, in a way that scares me." The honesty of his words seemed to surprise them both. And Tessa sat back, her gaze flickering with a mix of curiosity and caution. "I don't scare you, Zach," she said quietly. "You scare yourself." He was taken aback by the directness of her response. But it was true. He had been terrified of everything she represented, the things he couldn't control, the things he couldn't manipulate. And the more he tried to fight it, the deeper he sank into something he didn't understand. "I'm not used to not being in control," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tessa's expression softened, and she leaned in closer. "I don't need you to be in control. I just need you to be real." Zach felt his heart stop for a second. Her words cut straight through him, past the defenses he had so carefully constructed around himself. Real. It was a concept so foreign to him, so far removed from the life he had built, that he wasn't sure how to approach it. For the first time in a long time, Zach wasn't sure of anything. "I'm trying," he said, the words thick in his throat. "I don't know how to, but I am." Tessa studied him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer. "You don't need to know how. Just start. Start by being honest." The simple request felt like an invitation to something far more profound than either of them could have predicted. It felt like an opening, a chance to tear down the walls that had kept them both isolated for so long, but Zach wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The dinner passed in quiet conversation, the usual easy banter between them replaced by something deeper, more meaningful. Tessa talked about her past, about the heartbreak she had endured after a failed engagement, about how it had changed her, how it had forced her to build walls around her heart to protect herself from the people who didn't see her for who she really was. Zach listened, captivated by her vulnerability. but also feeling the weight of his own unspoken truths pressing against his chest. Tessa had allowed herself to open up, but he hadn't yet allowed himself to do the same. And that, he realized, was where the real challenge lay. It wasn't about winning her over with charm or playing the role of the perfect man. It was about opening himself up to someone who could see past the surface and into the heart of who he was, and who could see the man he was trying so desperately to become. As they finished their meal, Zach felt something shift in him. He no longer saw this as a game to win. It had become something far more complicated, far more real. He wasn't sure where this would lead, or if Tessa would ever truly trust him. But one thing was certain. The walls between them had started to crumble. But could he really allow himself to be vulnerable? Could he really let go of the armor he had spent years building? The answer wasn't clear. But for the first time, Zach was willing to find out. The glittering lights of the gala illuminated the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum. But to Zach Westbrook, they felt like spotlights on his failures. The event was supposed to be a celebration of his media empire's newest success, the launch of an exclusive new platform, a night filled with the city's most influential movers and shakers. He was supposed to be basking in admiration, soaking up the validation that came with success. But tonight, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around him were closing in. The buzz of the crowd, the laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, it all felt hollow. He didn't belong here, not anymore. And it wasn't just the weight of his empire pressing on him. It was the weight of his guilt, the knowledge that he had lied to Tessa, manipulated her trust, and played her as part of a game he never meant to win. But what really gnawed at him was the fact that he had grown to care for her. Really care. The kind of care that had him second-guessing every move, every word, every strategy. The bet, the initial plan, had become irrelevant long ago. He had wanted her. Not because of her disinterest, not because of the game, but because of the woman she was. Strong, passionate, compassionate, and beautiful in a way he hadn't allowed himself to see before. But now, as he looked across the room at her, standing there with her usual grace, speaking to one of the artists she admired, the nagging sense of dread returned. She had no idea. He had kept the secret for so long, even from himself. But tonight, something felt different. He could feel it in the way she glanced at him occasionally, her eyes a little colder than they had been before. Something had shifted, and he didn't know how to stop it. Tessa had been an elegant force throughout the evening, the kind of woman who could command a room without raising her voice, simply by being present. But even as she engaged with artists, spoke passionately about the work in front of her, and smiled politely at the upper crust of New York society, her mind was elsewhere. She had been hearing snippets of conversations around her, small pieces, fragments of chatter that seemed irrelevant at first. But now they coalesced into something bigger. One of Zach's closest friends, someone she hadn't recognized but had been introduced to earlier, had let something slip. At first, she thought she had misunderstood, but then she overheard it again. "Tessa Fitzgerald," the man had said with a chuckle, clearly not caring who heard. "I can't believe Zach's pulling this off. $5 million on the line, and he's already halfway there." The words had stung, even if she hadn't fully understood them at first. A bet? Her heart skipped a beat as the realization started to set in. They had all been betting on her ability to fall for him. Zach, with his charm, his wealth, his polished persona. He had been playing her all along. A pawn in some game he didn't even bother to tell her about. A piece in his empire of media and control. Her stomach twisted. Betrayal wasn't a word she used lightly, but she couldn't think of another that would fit. She had trusted him. More than that, she had allowed herself to believe that what they had shared, those late-night conversations about art, their casual dinners, their walks through the city, was real. That there was something more than his empire. Something authentic. But now she knew. It had all been a lie. Tessa's gaze locked with Zach's from across the room. He was talking to one of his business associates, his usual confident smile plastered on his face, the very image of a man who owned the world. But to her, he was just another liar. The hurt was sharp, but it wasn't the first time she had felt this way. There had been too many men in her life who had seen her as a conquest, who had treated her heart like a prize to be won. She had told herself she wasn't going to be like them, that she wasn't going to fall into the trap of letting someone manipulate her again. But now, here she was, standing in a room filled with the world's most powerful people, feeling smaller than ever. "Zach!" Tessa's voice cut through the noise of the ballroom, and he looked up, his face tightening as he saw the fire in her eyes. He excused himself from the conversation and walked toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. The last thing he expected was for her to confront him here, in front of everyone. But there was no avoiding it. He had been waiting for the moment when the truth would come to light. He just hadn't thought it would happen so soon. "I think we need to talk," she said, her tone cold, controlled. Zach nodded, his stomach twisting. He knew exactly what this was about, and part of him wondered if he'd been foolish to think he could keep the truth hidden for much longer. They stepped away from the crowd, moving toward a quieter corner of the gallery. The tension between them was palpable, crackling in the air like static. "Zach, I'm not sure I can even look at you right now," she said, her voice trembling, though her eyes never wavered. "Do you even know who I am? Or was this all just a game to you from the start?" Her words hit him like a physical blow. He had expected anger, but he hadn't been prepared for the raw pain in her voice. The hurt that laced every syllable was enough to make him feel like he was suffocating. Tessa took a step back, the space between them growing. "All this time I thought we were getting to know each other. I thought we were building something. But you've been playing me. You've been playing a game. And I was just another challenge for you to win." Zach opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was nothing he could say that would make this right, nothing that would fix what he had broken. "Tessa, She shook her head, cutting him off. "Don't. I don't want your explanations. I don't want your apologies. Because I've been here before. I've been the one who trusted someone, only to find out that they never really cared. They never saw me. They saw a project, a box to check off." Her words were like daggers, each one hitting its mark. Zach felt himself crumbling, every defense he had built for years falling away. "I'm not like them, Tessa," he finally said, his voice raw, desperate. This isn't just about the bet anymore. I care about you. I'm not pretending." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Zach thought she might actually believe him. But then, the hardness returned to her features, the walls she had spent years building to protect herself coming back up with frightening speed. "I don't believe you," she said softly. "Not anymore. I was never real to you, was I? I was just part of your game." Tessa turned and started walking away, each step further breaking him. He reached out, but she didn't stop. "Tessa, wait, please," he called, his voice louder now, more desperate. He wasn't ready to lose her, not like this. Not when he finally felt like he was starting to understand who she was. But she didn't turn around. And in that moment, Zach realized that his words, his actions, meant nothing anymore. He had lost her trust, and maybe even worse, he had lost himself in the process. The rest of the evening blurred for Zach. He wandered through the gala, half listening to his friends' congratulatory remarks. But his mind was miles away, trapped in the conversation with Tessa, replaying every word she had said. He had never felt so exposed, so completely defeated. The bet. It had started as a stupid wager, something he thought would be easy, a challenge to break up the monotony of his life. But somewhere along the way, it had turned into something else, something real. And now, it had shattered in front of him. As the night wore on, Zach excused himself and stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had done this to himself. He had played a game with Tessa's heart, and now he was paying the price. The city stretched before him, a sea of lights and noise. But none of it seemed real anymore. The success, the wealth, the empire, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was Tessa. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix what he had broken. Zach returned to his penthouse later that night, his mind still reeling. He had expected to feel angry, frustrated, anything but the hollow emptiness that consumed him now. He had never been in this position before, never had his own emotions turn against him in such a way. He dropped onto the sofa, his head heavy in his hands. He had to fix this. He couldn't lose her. But what could he possibly do now? Would she ever forgive him? Would she ever trust him again? The answer wasn't clear. But one thing was, he had made a mess of everything. And now, he had to face the full consequences of his actions. He had fallen for her, and in doing so, he had lost everything. The truth had come out, and now there was no going back. The city outside was as loud as ever, the hum of Manhattan's constant motion, a stark contrast to the silence that enveloped Zach Westbrook in his penthouse. The sprawling skyline that had once felt like a kingdom was now just a backdrop to his growing sense of emptiness. For the first time in years, Zach found himself with nothing to do, no plans, no strategies. The empire he had built, the success that had once defined him, all seemed meaningless now. What did it matter if his name was on every skyscraper in the city, if the one person who had made him feel something real was slipping through his fingers? He sat alone in his sleek, modern living room, the lights of the city reflecting off the glass walls that surrounded him. The penthouse was pristine, the epitome of luxury and success. But tonight, it felt like a gilded cage. He ran his hand over the glass of his scotch, his mind miles away from the drink in front of him. He had built an empire on the foundation of control. But for the first time, he realized how little control he had over his own heart. His thoughts kept returning to Tessa. He had known from the moment he met her that she wasn't like the others. She wasn't enamored by his wealth or his reputation. She didn't need him for anything. And that had made her the most intoxicating challenge of all. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing her as a challenge. He had started to see her as someone he could, no, someone he wanted, to build a life with. But it was too late now. He had ruined it, just like he had ruined everything else in his life with his arrogance and his pride. The days following the confrontation were a blur of guilt and self-loathing. Zach couldn't bring himself to leave the penthouse, not yet. How could he face the world when he had just shattered everything he had built? Every corner of the apartment, every piece of luxury he had amassed, felt like a reminder of his failures. He had never been afraid to face a challenge before. But this time was different. This time, the stakes were higher than any business deal or media acquisition. This was about the only person who had ever made him question the life he had chosen for himself. He spent hours reflecting on the moments he had shared with Tessa. The late-night walks through Central Park, the way she laughed at his jokes, the quiet conversations about art and the future. He had felt something with her that he had never felt before. Something real. Something raw. And yet, he had destroyed it with a bet. It wasn't just about the lie anymore. It was about the fact that he had treated her like a game to win, when she had always been so much more. He had been so wrapped up in his own sense of superiority, his own need to conquer everything in his path, that he had failed to see the real value of the woman standing in front of him. Tessa had challenged him in a way no one else ever had. She had made him feel things he didn't know how to deal with. Things like vulnerability, fear, and the terrifying notion that he might not have all the answers. But the reality was undeniable. Tessa didn't need him to be successful. She didn't need him to be the billionaire media mogul. She needed him to be something else entirely. She needed him to be honest. She needed him to be real. And that, Zach realized, was the hardest challenge of all. He had spent so long constructing the persona of Zach Westbrook, the powerful, successful, untouchable mogul, that he had forgotten who he really was underneath it all. He had built walls around his heart, just as Tessa had. But now, he knew he couldn't win her back by playing the same games. He needed to confront the truth. He needed to tear down the walls he had spent years building. Meanwhile, Tessa was struggling with her own emotions. She had spent the last few days in a fog of anger, hurt, and confusion. Every time she thought about Zach, her heart twisted. But it wasn't just because of the betrayal. It was because she still cared about him. She had tried to convince herself that he was just like every other man. Someone who saw her as a conquest, a trophy to be won, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much he had meant to her. She hadn't expected to feel this way. She hadn't expected him to get under her skin. She had worked hard to build a life that was independent of anyone else, to avoid falling into the same trap of being seen as a prize to be won. But Zach had made her believe in something more. He had made her feel like she mattered, like she was more than just the granddaughter of a civil rights legend. And that, more than anything, had hurt the most. Tessa had always prided herself on her independence. She had worked her entire life to build a career, to fight for causes she believed in, to push back against the expectations placed on her as a woman of color in a world dominated by privilege and power. She had always known that people saw her differently. Some respected her, but most just saw her as a token, a representative of her grandfather's legacy. But with Zach, she had felt seen. For the first time, she had felt like someone actually saw her for who she was. But now, that trust had been shattered. She couldn't let herself go back to him. Not after everything that had happened. Not after everything he had done. But still, a part of her longed for the man she had spent time with. The man who had laughed with her, who had listened to her talk about art, who had shared his own vulnerabilities. That man wasn't the one who had played a game with her heart. That man was real, and she wanted to believe in him. But the question remained, could she? Zach, however, was determined. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but he could change. He could prove to Tessa, and to himself, that he was capable of something more than the games he had always played. He had to be vulnerable. He had to face the fact that he had never truly been honest with anyone, least of all with the woman he was beginning to fall in love with. He made the decision to step away from his empire for a while. He couldn't keep hiding behind the facade of his wealth and success. He would take a break, focus on what really mattered, and become the man Tessa deserved. He wasn't going to win her back with grand gestures or flashy displays of wealth. He was going to win her back by being real, by showing her that he could be more than just the billionaire mogul. And so, Zach set about changing. He hired a personal trainer and started working on his fitness, not to impress anyone, but because he needed to feel better in his own skin. He took up new hobbies, things that had always interested him, but that he had never made time for, like painting and reading. He went to therapy, something he had always been too proud to do before. But he realized that he needed to work through his own issues if he was ever going to be the man Tessa could trust. He knew that proving his sincerity wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't interested in taking the easy route. He wanted to show Tessa that he was more than just a game, more than just a bet. He wanted to be someone worthy of her love. The days passed slowly, but Zach's resolve never wavered. He continued to work on himself, to strip away the layers of his past, and to confront the man he had been. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was necessary. He knew that if he ever wanted a chance with Tessa, he had to be willing to sacrifice everything that had made him who he was. As the weeks passed, he found himself thinking less about the bet and more about Tessa. He began to understand what she had meant when she had told him she didn't want to be seen as just a game. He had been blinded by his own arrogance, by his need to win. But now, he saw her for who she truly was. A woman with strength, passion, and a heart that deserved to be loved with honesty, not manipulation. Tessa wasn't ready to forgive him. He knew that. But he was ready to show her that he was worth the chance. Zach's journey of redemption had only just begun, and he knew it would take time. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He had started the real work, the work of becoming the man Tessa deserved. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. Zach stood at the entrance of the small gallery, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of awe and admiration. The space was simple yet elegant, adorned with minimalist art that spoke volumes with its quiet presence. It was the kind of place that didn't shout for attention, but invited it gently, drawing you in. And yet, amidst all the beauty, it was the woman at the center of it all that captured every ounce of his focus. Tessa was in her element, engaged in a conversation with an older woman who was nodding thoughtfully as Tessa spoke. Her eyes glistened with passion, her hands moving gracefully as she explained the stories behind the pieces. Zach could see the way she commanded the room, not with her wealth or influence, but with her intelligence and the quiet strength she exuded. It was different from the usual way he had seen women captivate crowds. This wasn't about charm or beauty. This was raw, unfiltered passion for what she loved. As Zach moved further into the gallery, he felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest. It wasn't the pressure he was used to, the suffocating expectations of being a billionaire mogul, the constant scrutiny of being at the top. This felt different. This felt like a place where he could finally breathe. Not as Zach Westbrook, the media tycoon, but as someone who genuinely cared about what was happening here. Tessa noticed him, of course. Her eyes flickered toward him for just a second, then continued their conversation without missing a beat. The gesture wasn't dismissive, not by any means. But it was clear. She wasn't here to cater to him, to make him feel important. She wasn't interested in playing the game. And for the first time, that didn't sting. It was the kind of feeling he'd been avoiding for so long. Humility. The feeling that he was simply a part of something, not the center of it. He liked it. He stood back, a quiet observer, feeling something in him shift as he watched her interact with the people around her. This was the woman he had been trying to win over. The woman who had never cared for his money or reputation. The woman who had made him question everything about himself. Tessa, for her part, was doing her best to keep the evening about the art. She had worked tirelessly to curate this exhibition. Weeks of long hours spent sourcing pieces, researching artists, crafting the narrative that tied it all together. This was her world. A world that she had built for herself, far removed from the world of power and privilege that Zach came from. She glanced around the room and caught Zach's gaze once more. This time, it lingered. Her heart skipped, and for a brief moment, she found herself distracted. There he was, standing in the corner, not the confident billionaire mogul she had come to expect, but just a man. A man who was quietly watching her, as though he wasn't there to take over the room, but to appreciate it from the outside. The change in him was evident, even from across the room. There was no arrogance in his stance, no forceful charm pushing him into the center of the conversation. There was no game being played, no mask to hide behind. For the first time, Zach was just there. Present, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. It was a little unnerving, to be honest. Tessa wasn't sure what had brought about this shift in Zach. The man she had confronted just a few weeks ago was different from the one standing in the corner now. The arrogance, the superiority that had once defined him, seemed to have melted away, replaced by something far more human. And despite everything that had happened, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was here for the right reasons. As the evening wore on, Zach found himself in the middle of a quiet conversation with one of Tessa's colleagues. It wasn't a conversation that would have been memorable by any means. But Zach found himself listening, actually engaging in a way he never had before. He was used to being the one who dominated conversations, who made people laugh or smile with his wit and charm. But tonight, he wasn't interested in impressing anyone. Tonight, he was just listening. For the first time, he was listening to the art, to the people around him, to the one person who had made him feel something deeper than any business deal ever had. As the conversation continued, Tessa's voice drifted across the room, drawing his attention back to her. She was speaking about the artists whose work was displayed on the walls, explaining their motivations, their struggles, their triumphs. She wasn't just curating the art. She was curating the very soul of it, weaving together the stories that made it so much more than just paint on a canvas. Tessa had always been an enigma to Zach. At first, he had seen her as a challenge, a beautiful woman who wasn't impressed by his wealth or charm. He had wanted to win her over, to make her fall for him, just as he had done with so many others. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that this wasn't a challenge he could win with money or power or even charm. This was something entirely different. This was about trust. This was about vulnerability. And as much as Zach hated to admit it, he was starting to understand what Tessa had meant when she said she wanted someone real. For the first time, he was no longer concerned with what he could offer her. He wasn't thinking about the grand gestures or the flashy displays of wealth. He was just there. And for some reason, that felt like the most honest thing he could do. Tessa was beginning to let her guard down. Slowly. But it was happening. She had watched Zach from across the room for the last hour, and while she was still hesitant, she couldn't deny that something had shifted. The man standing before her now wasn't the one who had made her feel like an experiment. This man was different. He was listening. He was respecting her space. He wasn't trying to take over. And that, she realized, was something she hadn't seen before. Not in Zach. Not in anyone. As the evening came to a close, Tessa found herself standing beside him, feeling the weight of the silence between them. She wasn't sure what to say, or if there was even anything to say. But there was a moment, a brief but significant moment, when Zach looked at her and she saw something in his eyes. A depth that had been absent before. He wasn't just here for the art. He wasn't just here to win her over. He was here because he wanted to understand. The night ended quietly, with Zach slipping away from the event as unobtrusively as he had arrived. But as he stepped outside into the crisp evening air, he couldn't help but feel like something had shifted inside him. Tessa had let him in, if only just a little, and that, in itself, was a victory. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But for the first time, Zach felt like he was finally on the right path. He wasn't here to win her over with power or influence. He was here to show her that he could be real. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. As for Tessa, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake in shutting him out so quickly. There was still a part of her that wanted to believe in Zach. But the trust was fragile, and the walls she had built were still high. But as she closed the gallery doors behind her, she allowed herself the briefest moment of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something real. Maybe Zach had finally proven that he was capable of change. Maybe for the first time, she could believe in the possibility of them. The Met Gala. The one night of the year when Manhattan's elite come together, dressed in their most extravagant, most daring ensembles. The most coveted ticket in the city, reserved for a select few who define culture, wealth, and influence. It was a night of glamour, spectacle, and, most importantly, status. For Zach, it was the epitome of the world he had always inhabited. Powerful business leaders, billion-dollar deals, and women who draped themselves over him like expensive jewelry. But tonight, none of that mattered. Zach stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse, adjusting his tuxedo with a practiced precision. The reflection staring back at him was the same one he had seen countless times before. Impeccably groomed, effortlessly charismatic. The face of Westbrook Media. The billionaire mogul. The man who had everything. And yet, as he fastened his cufflinks, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. Tonight wasn't about the power and prestige that came with this event. It wasn't about the business deals, the photographers, or the praise of his peers. Tonight, it was about Tessa. Tonight, he had to prove to her that he was no longer the man who played games, no longer the man who hid behind his wealth and influence. Tonight, he had to prove that he had changed, that he was worthy of her trust, her heart, her love. The sharp click of his phone broke his concentration. He glanced down to see a text message from Tessa. "I'll see you tonight. You've already changed everything, Zach. But this is still a test. For both of us." Her words struck him like a punch to the gut. A test, she was right. This was the ultimate test. If he could pass this, if he could make it through tonight without falling back into old habits, then maybe, just maybe, he could prove to her that his love for her was real, and that he wasn't the same man who had once treated their relationship like a bet. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't just fighting for her tonight. He was fighting for himself too. The Met Gala was in full swing by the time Zach and Tessa arrived. The red carpet was alive with flashing cameras, whispers of excitement, and the glint of diamonds and couture. As they walked together, Zach couldn't help but notice the way the room seemed to part for them. All eyes were on them. But for the first time, it didn't matter to Zach. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how he looked, how his empire was being reflected in the shiny surface of this world. He wasn't thinking about the whispers that followed them. He was only thinking about Tessa. She looked radiant in her gown, simple but breathtaking. The color of deep midnight blue, the fabric catching the light with each movement. She didn't need diamonds or $1,000 dress to shine. She had a quiet elegance that radiated from within. As they moved through the crowd, Zach felt like the whole night had been transformed into a blur of gold and silver. The glimmer of the gala fading into the background as his focus zeroed in on her. But there was a catch. As they made their way through the event, old habits began to surface. Women smiled at Zach, batting their lashes, trying to catch his eye. They came to him with the familiar air of want and desire, the same game he had played for years. They wanted a piece of him, his wealth, his attention, his time. And part of him wanted to play along. Part of him wanted to slip into the familiar, the easy part of his life, where he was the object of attention and admiration. He felt it, the pull, the temptation. But then his eyes met Tessa's. The way she looked at him, so focused, so real, cut through the fog of temptation. She wasn't looking at him with the same empty adoration he had grown used to. She was looking at him with genuine interest, a challenge in her eyes, as if she was silently asking, "Who are you really, Zach? Who are you when the cameras aren't rolling? When the money and the fame don't matter?" The question rattled him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer ready. There was no rehearsed charm, no well-practiced line. There was just a man standing before a woman who saw through all the walls he had carefully constructed. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid. They moved through the gala, meeting people, exchanging pleasantries, as Tessa commanded attention with her poise and intelligence. Zach found himself watching her, not as a partner or a challenge, but as a woman who had made him question everything. As the evening wore on, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led them here. The bet, his initial approach, the way he had played the game. But tonight, he was no longer playing. Tonight, he was showing Tessa who he really was. The night was drawing to a close when Zach found himself alone in a corner of the gala, away from the crowd. The music was loud, the laughter of the elite echoing in the distance. But in this moment, there was only Tessa. She had excused herself to speak to some of her colleagues, leaving Zach alone with his thoughts. He stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling city beneath them, and felt an overwhelming sense of loss. He had everything, wealth, success, power, but none of it meant anything if he couldn't have Tessa. He had thought he could win her over with money and charm, but he had been wrong. He realized now that what he truly wanted was something real, something that went beyond the games, beyond the riches, beyond the empire he had built. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. There she was, Tessa, looking both radiant and distant, like she had one foot in the world of the gala and one foot outside of it. She was walking toward him slowly, her expression unreadable. Zach opened his mouth to speak, to say something, but words failed him. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. He had spent so long pretending to be someone he wasn't. And now, standing here, he was lost. Tessa stopped in front of him, her eyes searching his, There was no judgment in them, no anger, just a quiet curiosity. "You've changed," she said softly. Zach swallowed hard. "I have. And I'm not the man I was when this started." Tessa tilted her head, considering him. "No," she said, her voice low. "You're not." Zach took a step forward. "Tessa, But she held up a hand, stopping him. "I know," she said. "I know you've changed. But it's not about the change, Zach. It's about whether you're willing to prove it. Not to me, but to yourself." Zach stared at her, struck by her words. She was right. He had been playing a game, even after the bet was over. He had been so focused on winning her, on proving he could be the man she wanted, that he hadn't stopped to think about what it really meant to be worthy of her. "I will," he said, his voice hoarse. "I will prove it to myself. And to you. Every day from now on." Tessa looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, for the first time that night, a smile touched her lips. It wasn't a grand smile, but it was real, honest. "Then let's take it one step at a time," she said, her voice steady. As the night drew to a close, Zach and Tessa found themselves standing on the balcony, looking out over the city. The weight of everything that had happened between them was still there. But for the first time, it didn't feel so heavy. It was a beginning, one that felt fragile, but real. They stood there, together, but not yet fully whole. But that was okay. Zach knew it would take time, and he was ready to put in the work. For the first time, he wasn't looking for the easy win. He wasn't playing a game. He was simply there, with her, ready to build something real. And as Tessa leaned against the railing beside him, Zach knew that this was the beginning of something new. Something that wasn't just about the money or the empire or the bet. It was about them. Paris had always been a dream. Not the kind of dream that was shiny or glamorous, but the one that tugged at your heart. The kind that made you believe there was more to life than just success and status. Zach had never really understood the charm of it. But now, as he walked alongside Tessa through the quiet Parisian streets, he found himself lost in the city's unique magic. He'd spent so many years building his empire, surrounded by people who only saw the wealth, the power, and the persona of Zach Westbrook. But this was different. This was real. And for the first time, Zach realized that this moment, this quiet evening in Paris with Tessa, was all that mattered. They found themselves sitting at a small, quaint cafe, tucked away in the narrow streets of Montmartre, the kind of place that wasn't packed with tourists, the kind of place that only locals knew about. The tables were simple, small wooden ones, with faded checkered cloths, and the air smelled of fresh coffee and baked croissants. Tessa had found the spot, and Zach didn't question her choice. He just followed, happy to be with her. The evening air was crisp, carrying with it the faint sounds of life in Paris. The distant chatter of friends, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional honking of a car. Zach watched Tessa as she took her seat, looking so at ease in this city, in this moment. It was almost as if she had found a version of herself here, away from the hustle and demands of New York, away from the life he had lived. For a moment, he could only look at her, wondering how he had gotten so lucky. "Are you just going to stare at me all night?" Tessa's voice brought him back to the present, her lips curling into a teasing smile. Zach chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Sorry, I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how much has changed in such a short time," he said honestly. leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. And how I've somehow managed to find a way to be completely lost in your world. Tessa's eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table. You've always been a part of my world, Zach. You just never realized it until now. Zach's heart skipped a beat at the sincerity in her voice. He had heard her words before, but now, sitting across from her in this peaceful cafe, he finally understood their weight. He wasn't just part of her world. He was a part of something deeper, something that mattered more than all the things he had spent years chasing. I want to make it real, Zach said, his voice quieter now, as if the words were more than just promises. They were a realization, a commitment. I want our life together to be real. No more games, no more pretending, just us, building something that lasts. Tessa's eyes flickered, a mix of vulnerability and hope dancing in them. Zach, it's not going to be easy. We've both been through a lot, and I've spent so much of my life protecting myself from disappointment, from people who didn't see me for who I truly am. I won't just forget what happened, but I believe in you. I believe in us. Zach reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. He could feel the coolness of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers that told him she was just as nervous as he was. He had always known how to control every situation in his life, his business, his empire, his image. But this was different. This was love. And it was the one thing he hadn't learned how to control. I know I've hurt you, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. And I know I've made mistakes that I can't take back, but I want to show you that I can be the man you deserve. That I'm not the man I was when I made that bet. That I'm here, not for a game, not for a win, but because I want you. I want us. Tessa's gaze held his, and for a moment, it was as if the world outside that cafe no longer existed. It was just the two of them in that quiet space, understanding each other for the first time, without any barriers between them. I know, Tessa said quietly. And I see the changes in you, Zach. I've seen it in the way you've been there for me, the way you've let me into your life. But it's not about what you can do for me. It's about what we can build together. And I think we're both ready for that. Zach's heart surged, but he kept his expression steady. There was so much more to say, but it felt like there were no words that could fully capture what he was feeling. All he could do was show her, every single day, that he was committed to this new beginning. A real beginning. One that was built on trust, honesty, and love. I want to make it official, Zach said, his voice stronger now, as if he had made a decision deep within himself. Not just here in Paris, not just in this moment, but for the rest of our lives. Tessa raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a playful smile. Official? What do you mean by that? Zach's smile deepened. He stood up from his chair and walked around the table to stand beside her. He leaned down, and in that quiet moment, he whispered in her ear, I'm ready to build a future with you. To commit to everything that's real. No more games, no more pretending. Just us. A future we can both believe in. Tessa's breath caught in her throat, and she stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his. And you're sure about this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You're sure you're ready for this kind of commitment? This kind of life? Zach nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I'm ready to make this work, Tessa. I'm ready to show you that I can be the man you need me to be. The man you've always deserved." Tessa's eyes shimmered with emotion, and she took a deep breath, as if the weight of everything they had been through was finally lifting. For the first time, Zach felt like he had truly stepped out of the shadow of his past. He wasn't just a billionaire mogul anymore. He was a man who had found something real, something worth fighting for. "I'm ready too," Tessa said softly. "Let's do this, Zach. Let's build something that's ours. Together." They stood in the middle of that small Parisian cafe, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, and for the first time, they both felt like they were in the right place. The world outside may have been full of uncertainty, but with each other, they knew they could face anything. As they walked out of the cafe hand in hand, Zach couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had led them here. The bet, the mistakes, the lies. But now, those things were in the past. They were just stepping stones to something better, something real. And as they walked through the streets of Paris, the city that had given them both a fresh start, Zach knew that they were finally building a life worth living. One that was filled with honesty, vulnerability, and love. The future, once so uncertain, was now full of promise.